How's it going, everyone? It's Hobby from the SpongeBob. Today is May 13th, 2021, and today we're going to do a wind shear analysis for this hurricane season to determine how many hurricanes you guys will receive and if it'll make a major impact in the hurricane season. As I'm gonna go in detail with this wind shear analysis, as I'll primarily focus on wind shear and focus on the other factors that could change the hurricane season in later videos. But before I begin, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather guns, and make sure to like if you like this video. Make sure to turn on post notifications if you want to see even more weather guns. So let's begin by taking a look at the current IR loop over over the entire northern Atlantic, and you see that for the most part we're seeing all the thunderstorm activity move directly to the east, which is typical this early in the year. The wind shear is just far too strong to see any sort of thunderstorm activity to move direct, or any sort of major thunderstorm activity to move directly towards the east this early in the season, when the wind shear is just very strong. The upper level winds and the westerly winds are very strong. However, I do expect it, of course, to subside once the air temperatures begin to rise all throughout the Atlantic, and we're going to see overall just less unstable air and cold air interacting with that warm air, which is inducing just very strong westerly winds in the upper levels. And you see that the lower level winds, and you see pretty much on the lower cloud tops, you do see that the clouds are moving towards the east, which shows that the lower level winds are, of course, moving from east to west like they should. However, the upper level winds are still moving directly to the east, which means that there's just still very strong wind shear, way too strong for any sort of tropical cyclone development in the near future. And the GFS model pretty much exemplifies this in the 200 millibar wind speed map, where in the 200 millibar height wind speed map, where we do see just strong upper level winds all throughout the Atlantic, maybe some weaker upper level winds in the Caribbean, but other than that, it's pretty much, the wind shear is pretty much just swallowing the entire Atlantic. However, in this video, I will forecast how much wind shear you guys should receive for this hurricane season. So let's begin by taking a look at how the wind shear has been over the past several months compared to average. And you see, as of right now, despite the entire Atlantic being swallowed up by just a ton of wind shear and just strong upper level winds, we are below average when it comes to wind shear, at least in the Caribbean area, where we do see that for I'd say a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks, we've been in the below average category when it comes to wind shear. Now, obviously, this does fluctuate up and down typically, and it happens typically all year. However, the trend I've been noticing for this year so far is that for the most part, we've been in below average wind shear all throughout the Caribbean, which is very concerning, especially when if this trend does continue into the hurricane season, because you see that throughout the months of January and March, for the most part, the wind shear has been below average, anomalous in a below average category, and that's certainly concerning, because if that continues into the peak of the hurricane season, that could mean that the Caribbean could be in for just a very potent hurricane season. However, again, this does fluctuate. We obviously did see some times where the wind shear was above average for that time of the year, or what's more than or right around there. But for the most part, the trend's been more towards less wind shear than typical for a lot of Caribbean, and that's certainly concerning to see that trend continue throughout the year for the most part, and to see the entire Atlantic overall, how the wind shear has been. It's been, I'd say, up and down. It isn't like the Caribbean, where I'd say it's mostly below average, the wind shear. But for the Atlantic, the wind shear has pretty much been fluctuating a lot. So that's definitely good news. At least it isn't like the Caribbean, where the trend has been less wind shear than typical. But still, we still need to keep a close eye on it, because on the Atlantic overall, because there still is that possibility that maybe the wind shear does trend lower during the peak of the hurricane season. So to forecast this, we're going to take a look at the we're gonna first take a look at the Enzo pattern for this year because obviously this is one of the major determinants in how much wind shear you'll receive throughout the Atlantic for the 2021 hurricane season. And you see that for the most part, the forecast for most of the hurricane season is a neutral phase, while towards the late during the later months of the hurricane season, we do see that there's a higher probability of La Nina towards the end of it. However, during the peak, more likely than not, well, I wouldn't say more likely, but the most likely scenario is that you will experience a neutral phase. However, a La Nina phase is almost equally as possible as a neutral phase closer to September, which is a peak of the hurricane season. And we obviously saw how La Nina hurricane seasons played out in the past, such as last year, where we saw the most storms in history for the Atlantic during a La Nina phase because there was just an insane lack of wind shear throughout the Atlantic. And for this year, there's not really good. The forecast isn't expecting exactly a La Nina. However, there's still a good possibility of a La Nina entering August and September. So we do not want to rule that out. And even during a neutral phase, I tend to see the wind shear in the Atlantic tend to be lower than usual for the most part because I have seen neutral Enzo patterns bring out very potent hurricane seasons in the past. I think 2018 might have been in a neutral Enzo pattern, and that was quite an active year. We obviously saw Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Michael in 2018, which were just two very devastating hurricanes. So a neutral phase certainly could bring out a major hurricane season, and typically it does bring less wind shear than usual. So you do not want to underestimate a neutral phase because neutral phases are just as likely to bring less wind shear as, let's say, a La Nina phase. Well, I wouldn't say just as likely, but nearly as likely as a La Nina phase. So we need to keep a close eye on this over the next couple months to see the exact probabilities because if we're gonna be in a La Nina fate pattern headed into the peak of the hurricane season, that would mean that the wind shear will be very light for a lot of the Atlantic, and that will promote a lot of hurricane activity. So we need to wait and see. However, the most likely scenario is a neutral pattern, which typically does bring below average or light wind shear throughout the Atlantic. So I do expect a higher probability of more hurricane development and more cyclonic activity throughout the Atlantic with less wind shear. So we need to keep a close eye on that. Now moving on, another thing that I want to take a look at is the North American or the North Atlantic Oscillation, and I've talked about this before in a lot of my videos in the past and in a lot of my United States forecast videos. And typically, and if you're new to this channel, basically what North America or North Atlantic Oscillation means is that when the oscillation index is in the negative pattern, that means that we're more likely to see big jet stream dips because when the Atlantic Oscillation is in a negative pattern, that means that the ridge in the middle of the Atlantic and the low pressure in the extreme northern portions of the Atlantic are very weak, which means that the westerly winds and the pressure gradient between the ridge and the low pressure are very weak, which means the westerly winds are weak, and that means the jet stream is more likely to meander southward because it's less likely that the weaker ridge and the weaker low pressure system would steer the jet stream winds directly to the east because the winds are so weak in the negative scenario. However, if the Atlantic Oscillation is in a positive scenario, that means that the ridge in the middle of the Atlantic is stronger and that the low pressure in the extreme northern portions of the Atlantic is stronger as well. So that means that the westerly winds are stronger and less jet stream dips as a result of that. So you might be asking, what does this mean for the hurricane season if we're in a negative or a positive phase? So long story short, pretty much if we're in a negative phase, that means more jet stream dips are bound to happen, which means that hurricanes are bound to experience a lot more wind shear, and as a result, I think they're more likely to head out to sea and mainly become fish storms because when we see more jet stream dips, it's more likely that hurricanes will be steered up to the north and will avoid land entirely and a lot of the mainland U.S. entirely. So as a result, it means less. It typically means not only less potential storms that could form. It could also mean that we'll experience less landfalls if the negative Arctic oscillation is strong. However, if we're in a positive Arctic oscillation during the peak of the hurricane season, that means we're less likely to experience jet stream dips, and that definitely raises the possibility of hurricanes getting closer to the mainland U.S. because there isn't going to be really any jet stream dips the that would steer any storms out to sea or potentially hinder any tropical cyclone development entirely. So, as you could see over the past several months, ever since April, we've been in a negative Atlantic oscillation, and you see that. You see that typically when we're either in a positive or negative Atlantic oscillation, that it typically lasts for at least a couple months or at least 1 to 3 months. So it isn't a pattern that fluctuates like crazy. So we definitely need to keep in mind when making this forecast. And you see that we've been in a negative Atlantic oscillation since April. So and now we're in the middle of May. The forecast is that the negative Atlantic oscillation is expected to continue into June. So this is concerning because there's only so much time that we will be in a negative Atlantic oscillation. As I think at some point, and unfortunately at the worst timing, we will get back into a positive Atlantic oscillation, which means that we're less likely to see jet stream dips and more hurricane development is possible as a result of less jet stream dips. However, take it with a grain of salt because we could easily get back into a negative Atlantic oscillation headed into September or the peak of the hurricane season. So we just need to wait and see. But as of right now, I'd say more likely than not, we're gonna be more in a positive pattern headed into, let's say, June, July, and August, and maybe get back into the negative pattern, which will hinder hurricane development maybe in September. That's the best case scenario. But I do think in August, which is a very active month for hurricanes, we will be most likely in a positive Atlantic oscillation, which will raise the chance of hurricane development. So we need to keep a close eye on this. Keep in mind that the Atlantic oscillation isn't as big of a pattern as, let's say, the Enzo pattern, because the Enzo pattern really dictates wind shear all throughout the Atlantic. The Atlantic oscillation doesn't do it as much, but it's still at least something to keep in mind. So take my forecast when it comes to the Atlantic oscillation with a grain of salt, because it isn't as let's say game changing as, let's say, the Enzo pattern is when it comes to hurricane season. But I think it's concerning that we might be in a positive Atlantic oscillation come right around the peak of the hurricane season. But another thing we also need to keep in mind is also another thing that not a lot of people are pointing out is also the precipitation in Africa over the next several months, because there have been studies that show that when it's more moist right around the Saharan desert region of Africa, that typically means that there's less wind shear, or wind shear is very light over the main development region of the Atlantic, and it really has to do with sort of the monsoon patterns where when it's more moist right around the Saharan desert, typically we see a monsoon pattern that promotes more easterly upper level winds rather than westerly upper level winds, and that promotes tropical cyclone development because when the upper level winds are coming from the east, it's pretty much coinciding or pretty much going the same direction as the lower level winds, and that means that there's very light wind shear when we don't see much of a change in wind direction with height, and and a monsoon pattern would certainly shift the winds from the upper level winds from westerly to easterly right around the main development region. Taking a look at the forecasted precipitation based off of what the CFS model is saying over the Saharan desert region of Africa, you see that for June, for the most part, it's mainly going to be average. There are some areas where it's going to be drier than average, but it gets worse into July, where you see that for a lot of the Saharan desert region, there is more precipitation than usual throughout the month of July. So that could certainly mean that there's a monsoon season going on, which will mean that more easterly winds are likely. And you see August, it becomes even worse, where we do see areas much more moist than average. And not only does this mean that there's more tropical disturbances likely to come off the African coast, but we're more likely to see lighter wind shear as a result of easterly upper level winds coinciding with the lower level winds, and this continues on to September. To show you guys this, here is a wind shear map comparing the wind shear over the main development region during when like the Saharan desert is drier than average to when the Saharan desert is wetter than average as a result of a monsoon. And you see that the upper level winds completely shift from more of a westerly direction to an easterly direction when there is a monsoon season going on. So let me show you guys the evidence which shows the study that shows you that that a more moist Saharan desert is correlated with less wind shear. There's a long summary, but let me but still it is typically long story short, typically a more moist Saharan desert means that we're more likely to see less wind shear over the Atlantic and of the main development region of the Atlantic. So I'd say that more likely than not, less wind shear than expected should be the case throughout the Atlantic for this hurricane season. So you guys need to prepare because this is likely going to be just a very active hurricane season, and I do expect light wind shear right around the main development region of the Atlantic, and I do expect maybe a little bit of wind shear right around the Caribbean as usual, but I think the light wind shear throughout most of the Atlantic will be the case, dominate pretty much, and we will see a more active hurricane season as a result. But yeah, guys, I guess that's it for this video. I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather-related content. Make sure to like if you like this video. Make sure to turn on post notifications if you want to see even more weather-related content. And I hope you guys have a good day.